It is with the very deepest sense of pride that on behalf of the Anti-Defamation League, I present America's Democratic Legacy Award to the President of the United States, John F. Kennedy.
The men who first shaped the democratic legacy that you honor tonight were filled with a sense of excitement and of wonder at the importance of the events in which they were participating. America was to be the great experiment, a testing ground for political liberty, a model for democratic government. And although the first task was to mold a nation on these principles here in this continent, we would also lead the fight against tyranny in all continents. This is a great inheritance. It is a proud privilege to be a citizen of the great republic, to realize that we are the descendants of 40 million people who left other countries, other familiar scenes, to come here to the United States to build a new life, to make a new opportunity for themselves and their children. I think it is not a burden, but a privilege to have the chance to share that great concept among all of our people, to make this really, as it was for them, a new world for us, and indeed for all those who look to us. That is what this organization has stood for 50 years. That's what this country has stood for 200 years. And that's what this country will continue to stand for. Thank you.
Help me God. So help me God. Congratulations.
These 25 men and women, service members and spouses, it is an honor to join everyone here for the first time in calling you our fellow Americans. Together, all of you remind us that America is and always has been a nation of immigrants. Throughout our history, immigrants have come to our shores in wave after wave from every corner of the globe. Every one of us, unless we're Native American, has an ancestor who was born somewhere else. The basic idea of welcoming immigrants to our shores is central to our way of life. It is in our DNA. We believe our diversity, our differences, when joined together by a common set of ideals, makes us stronger. And that's why, if we want to keep attracting the best and the brightest from beyond our shores, we're going to have to fix our immigration system, which is broken, and pass common sense immigration.
I come to the neighborhood Walmart a lot. It's a grocery store, but without all the other household items, so you're getting exactly what you need at a lower price.
It's a lot quicker to flow through the aisles. I find the prices are unbeatable.
I'm here all the time for everything, produce, vegetables.
I work full time, I have 2 children, I'm on the go constantly, so having affordable products to buy for our children is priceless.
I have a family of 4, so every penny counts.
Every minute counts when you're trying to get the kids home and then, ready for school the next day.
The biggest thing with this place is it's very convenient. I enjoy shopping here.
So those of us who study immigration history think in terms of why people leave their homelands and why they come here. And those are generally encapsulated in 2 words, push and pull. Something pushes them out of their homeland and something has pulled them to the United States. Now obviously in the earliest cases of slavery, they were not necessarily pushed from their homeland, but they were taken from their homeland. But the reason why they were taken is because there was labor to be done here in the United States. Okay. And it was a global force. The slave trade was fairly global, at least in the Atlantic, and later Asia would become involved in it as well. So here you have a forced migration.
Hundreds of thousands of Africans were mercilessly captured and taken prisoner in their own lands, then put on ships bound for America, where they were sold into a life of hard labor for no pay and no chance of freedom.
Immigration also during the 19th century was usually male-dominated, males in their prime working years between the years of 18 to 25. The Irish being the one exception. Eventually there would be more Irish women who immigrated than Irish men. Immigrants to this day often follow established patterns. They leave one village or one city and go to another city in the United States because someone has already established that pattern for them. People go to where they know people. And those people here often can arrange for jobs and employment and places to live and so on. It was often said that your first job when you got off the boat was whoever picked you up at the docks. Now people say your first job is whoever picks you up at the airport.
Before long, millions of immigrants were arriving on America's shores. They passed through immigration processing stations like Ellis Island in New York and Angel Island in San Francisco Bay. This wave was much more diverse than before. Coming mainly from Southern Europe, it was led by Italians, Poles, Greeks, Swedes, Norwegians, Hungarians, Jews, Lebanese, and Syrians.
It was as if God's great promise had been fulfilled.
I've gone into a free land. I don't think I ever can explain that feeling that I had that time.
It's not my native land, but it means more to me than my native land. It means more to me than my native land.
Any country on earth, this never happened. And then become a human being again. It's a miracle.
And everybody had hopes. And one thing I was sure, and thousands like me, that the degradation, the abuse, and the privation that we had in Europe, we wouldn't have here.
This group was young. Most were under 30 years old, mainly because an entire generation of the children of farmers and factory workers in Europe and the Russian Empire couldn't find work because the owners of the farms and factories preferred to have an efficient machine that they didn't have to pay do the work instead of a human being. Well, this was fine by America, whose steel, coal, automobile, textile, and garment production industries were booming. It happily took in this pool of eager, hard workers and put them to work in its growing industrial cities. Before long, the United States had leapt to the front ranks of the world's economic giants. And when the Americans entered the conflict themselves in 1917, U.S. industry was now tasked with supplying its own soldiers too. It was during this 50-year immigration wave, from about 1870 to 1920, when many well-off, white, native-born Americans began to consider mass immigration a danger to the health and security of the country. They started actively organizing to exert political power to slow it down. The first immigration. After the quota laws passed by the U.S. Congress in the 1920s, immigration was capped for the first time in American history. One of the exceptions to the strict quotas were documented contract workers from the Western Hemisphere who could come into and out of the U.S. freely. The other major exception were the hundreds of thousands of refugees who were allowed in, mainly Jews escaping the horrors of the Holocaust during and after World War II, and the roughly 400,000 families who fled Cuba after the Castro-led revolution of 1959. The U.S. entrance into World War II also meant many more Mexican workers were needed to fill in for all the young American men who were off fighting the Germans in Europe and the Japanese in the Pacific. At the end of this period, between 1944 and 1954, the number of immigrants coming from Mexico increased by 6,000%, as many Latin American workers were offered low-wage agricultural jobs in the American Southwest as part of the Bracero program. But large numbers of Mexicans without the necessary paperwork came in search of the American dream too, and what followed is one of the ugliest periods in U.S. immigration history. The final era of immigration to America is the one we're still currently in, which began in 1965 with the passage of the Hart-Celler Act. This law finally replaced the unfair quota system with a policy that gives preference to immigrants who have relatives already in the United States, or people with job skills that are highly sought after. All other past restrictions targeting specific groups were thrown out. This was one of the crown jewels in President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society program, and it fundamentally shifted who was allowed in. In 1970, 60% of immigrants came from Europe. This number just fell off a cliff by the year 2000, when only 15% were from Europe. The one thing that didn't change were the many undocumented immigrants from Latin America who continued to come across the border in search of a better life. So, in an effort to address this, in 1986, President Ronald Reagan signed the Immigration Reform and Control Act, which gave green cards to about 2.7 million immigrants. It was the largest single moment of legalization in American history. As a conservative from the anti-immigration party in modern America, the Republican Reagan compromised in exchange for more restrictions on employers who hire illegal immigrants and tighter border security. But it was a flawed law in a number of ways. Mainly, it didn't effectively fix the broken system that was allowing businesses to hire illegal immigrants in the first place. So since the businesses could still break the rules, many low-paying jobs remained for the millions of undocumented immigrants in America that the law still didn't legalize. The bill also didn't adequately fund and equip the Border Patrol, which meant there was still a fairly consistent flow of people coming across the border. To fix some of these problems that still remained, Senator Ted Kennedy introduced and Congress passed the Immigration Act of 1990, which President George H.W. Bush signed into law. This increased the number of legal immigrants entering the United States from around 500,000 per year to 700,000, an increase of 40%. This bill is also noteworthy because it was bipartisan, with a democratically controlled Congress working with a Republican president to pass major, common-sense immigration reform. Since the passage of that 1990 bill, about 1 million immigrants on average legally achieve residence in the United States each year. These are the top 10 countries, ranked by the number of legal immigrants from these countries who came to the United States in 2013, according to the Department of Homeland Security. According to the 2010 census, these are the countries from which all immigrants currently in the United States came from, ranked by the total number of people in America who say they were born in each country. Today, 14.3% of the total American population is foreign-born. That's more than 45 million people. The United States is home to nearly 20% of all the immigrants in the world, and it's estimated that more than 10 million of those immigrants are here illegally, living in the shadows.
Angelica Hernandez was 9 when she first crossed the border with her mother and sister.
I still remember crossing the desert, having to sleep in the desert because it was getting too late and we had been walking for hours. And my mom would hold, my sister in one arm and me on the other arm and, just pray that nothing would happen.
But their human smuggler was pulled over for speeding and they were deported. Their second crossing succeeded. Entering school as a 4th grader, Hernandez was teased because she spoke no English. Pinal County, Arizona Sheriff Paul Babu has spent much of his military and law enforcement career battling human smugglers. Deputies in his county, 70 miles north of the border, last year engaged in 350 high-speed pursuits involving drug and human smugglers.
They look at these people, these humans, as product. They don't care about their safety. They'll leave them for dead. They get in a wreck and just walk away.
Babu strongly supports Arizona laws cracking down on illegal immigration.
The impact has been so tremendous, not only billions of dollars in impact to our budget, but the crimes that are associated. Many crimes committed against the illegals themselves.
The sheriff and the student, one trying to enforce the law, the other trying to stay a step ahead of it. Angelica Hernandez, the little girl who couldn't speak English, this week begins work on her master's degree at Stanford.
Gracias, Dios mío, por la comida que nos das hoy.
Hernandez graduated from Arizona State despite losing a scholarship twice because of Arizona laws restricting benefits for illegal immigrants.
Being undocumented, it's something that gives you so many different qualities and strengthens you, because you learn to overcome so many things.
Now she's filling out paperwork to apply for President Obama's Deferred Action Program, giving temporary legal status to young illegal immigrants.
It is an election year, so we don't know if he did it because of that or he's trying to get the Latino vote. But in the end, we knew it was a win for us.
Not for Babu, who sees it as an unenforceable federal mandate and another lure bringing hundreds of thousands of people through his county illegally.
President Obama wants to talk about what do we do with these 10 to 20 million people. Well, a lot of Americans, including myself, say before we have that discussion, let's secure the border. We as a country have not enforced the law. And because of that, we're at the situation we're at today.
Hernandez is ineligible for a driver's license in Arizona. On this day, she's going to have her photo taken for her deferred action application, essentially breaking the law to become legal. She worries Mitt Romney would end the Deferred Action Program, leaving her ineligible for the job she wants in alternative energy when she finishes grad school. Babu worries President Obama will legalize more illegal immigrants and keep his deputies busy chasing smugglers. Casey Wyan, CNN, Pinal County, Arizona.
People forget that the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986, which was the nation's last large-scale legalization program, was under President Reagan. And what that act did is it ended up legalizing 2.7 million people in various categories. The main categories were people that were in the country from January 1st, 1982 up to the point of the program. And also certain Cuban Haitian entrants, agricultural workers, and then it also moved up what's known as the registry date, which is the date where very long-term residents in the United States can ultimately legalize. So the date had been people who had been here before 1948, and it moved it up to 1972. So it's best known as a legalization program. However, there were two other parts to the program. One was increased border enforcement, and the second was to make it a crime, and it hadn't been a crime before, to actually hire unlawful immigrants. And it also created sanctions for employers that did that. The issue was that the sanctions weren't strictly enforced, and the bigger issue was that it didn't change the legal immigration system. And it kind of led to because it didn't do that, it led to the creation of a fairly significant unauthorized population in the United States.
For Sylvia, this is a big day. After 5 years of legal proceedings, she's reached her final hearing. Today, immigration officials will tell her if she'll be sent back to Mexico, a country she left more than 20 years ago to make a better life for herself in the US. After 2 hours of waiting, the verdict is given.
10 minutes ago, the immigration authorities told me I'm out of options with my case, that there's nothing else I can do. They've given me 2 weeks to leave.
It was along this beach that Sylvia and her husband first entered California back in 1992. At the time, the border wasn't as well guarded. There were fewer patrols and no fence. Once they were in the country, false papers were easy to obtain. For 2 decades, Sylvia lived what appeared to be a normal American life. She got a job at a hotel and had 3 children. But her past caught up with her when a colleague reported her to the authorities.
The only thing I said to the police was that everything we have, we've got through our own hard work. We've never done anything wrong.
An estimated 11 million people live in the US illegally, at constant risk of deportation, even while large parts of the economy depend on their low-paid labor.
It's a system that in some perverse way works in the sense that you have people in the country without papers, but it's a flexible, disposable, expendable workforce. They live here for a long time, have kids here, work here, pay their taxes, but then all of a sudden that the enforcement becomes stiffer.
Sylvia is on the receiving end of this enforcement and is preparing to leave her home of 20 years. Her 2 sons are staying put. As they were born here, they have American passports.
I'm gonna stay here and keep studying, go to college, and have to support my little brother so they could go to school here and help them become something better here. And we're gonna be visiting my mom once a week.
Sylvia is moving to Tijuana, a few minutes' drive from the border. If there is a silver lining for her, it's that she'll get to see her husband for the first time since he himself was deported from the US 3 years ago.
Pedro makes $12 an hour digging this irrigation ditch outside a garage here in Santa Fe. He moved to New Mexico this summer because he's an illegal immigrant and he was fearful of Arizona's new immigration law.
I understand there's a frustration that people think there's too much competition in the workplace. I understand why some people would want us to go back.
But Pedro doesn't want to go back to Mexico. He's been in the U.S. as an undocumented worker for almost half his life.
How many years have you been out of Mexico?
20 years, 21 years.
Do you have any family in Mexico?
No more family.
Though much has been said about the benefits illegal immigrants enjoy in the U.S., the fact is many of them say life here is much harder than you might imagine.
Where's your room?
Here, my room is over here.
Pedro lives with a Mexican family whom he recently met. This is where he sleeps.
That is my bed. I don't have any clothes. The only clothes I have.
This room contains all his worldly possessions. He needed money and sold some of his other things when he left Arizona.
How hard is it to have so little? You have a sleeping bag, you only have 4 shirts, you have 2 pairs of shoes. It's all you own in the world right now. How difficult is it for you?
It's really, really difficult. I think nobody wants to get this kind of life.
Hard as life is, and as long as he's been living in the shadows here, he still has big dreams. To someday get his contractor's license, to get a formal education, and to find a wife.
I have a lot of hope. I want to restart again.
You have a lot of hope that things will get better for you.
Yes.
To be clear, Pedro would like to be a U.S. citizen, but like so many illegal Mexican immigrants, doesn't want to go back to Mexico indefinitely while waiting for the small possibility of approval, especially with no family there. He feared that if he stayed in Arizona, he would be arrested for a motor vehicle violation and get deported back to Mexico.
What were you scared of in Arizona?
Well, the police, the sheriff.
But in New Mexico, which is widely considered more tolerant to immigrants than Arizona, There are residents who think their state needs to be more strict.
Do you feel that New Mexico needs to toughen its laws against illegal immigrants?
Do they need to? Well, considering the threat, terrorism, I would say, yeah.
Pedro says he thinks the bad guys should be kicked out too, but he says he's a good guy.
You've been in this country 21 years.
Yes.
Do you feel more like a Mexican or an American?
In America.
Despite new pressures in the new law in Arizona, Pedro says he's digging in, more committed than ever to staying in the U.S. Gary Tuckman, CNN, Santa Fe, New Mexico.
As the presidential race heats up, there's a whole lot of noise out there about immigration.
Illegal immigration.
Illegal immigration.
Illegal immigration.
Illegal immigration.
Illegal immigration.
It's hard to separate fact from fiction, so here are some of the biggest immigration myths busted. Donald Trump framed the debate with these now infamous words.
They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists.
But guess what? The facts don't agree. No studies out there actually link violent crime to immigrants. One study even found that immigrants are less likely to be involved in crime than the rest of the population. The violent crime rate in the US actually went down as the number of immigrants increased. It's almost as if people who come here are more interested in making a better life for themselves. As for the idea of folks flocking to the US illegally in record numbers, also not true. The number of undocumented immigrants has actually gone down from 2007 to 2012. Only 12% of people living in the US were born somewhere else. And undocumented immigrants? They're only 3.5% of the population. About half of undocumented immigrants in the US are from Mexico, but here's the kicker. Net migration between the US and Mexico is, get this, 0. That means that there are just as many people going to Mexico as there are coming to the US. Believe it or not, immigrants are not stealing your jobs. Undocumented immigrants make up only 5% of the US labor force, and they pay billions in local and state taxes. So they're funding programs like Social Security and other benefits that they don't necessarily get. That said, only a third of undocumented immigrants work in the formal economy, which means the country loses around $20 billion in payroll tax every year. Trump wants all undocumented immigrants to go, which is strange for a guy who says he gets the economy. The US economy would lose $2.6 trillion over 10 years if all undocumented immigrants left. And the actual process of deporting them would cost taxpayers $285 billion over 5 years. For that price, you could hire more than 1 million public high school teachers and pay their salaries for 5 years. And deporting undocumented immigrants isn't necessarily what the American public wants. 2 out of 3 Americans support some sort of path to citizenship. Could it be because they realize that, with the exception of Native Americans, everyone in the US originally came from somewhere else?
A steady stream of bodies. Last month alone, someone was murdered nearly every hour in this poor country. Bullets lodged in the chest, sometimes the head. People shoot to kill in El Salvador.
Quizás una 22, 25. Quizás la más alta. Es algo preocupante realmente. Pero ahí no sé qué decirle, ¿verdad?
They catalog the dead. Some have no name. It's been another busy night at this morgue in San Salvador. Doctors say these two men arrived in the middle of the night, both killed in shootings. They say 90% of all the bodies they received die that way, bearing all the marks of gang violence. Another mother at the scene of her son's murder. She and others turn to prayer. There's no government counseling or support. God is called on often here in the country named the Savior. His father tells us it must have been God's will. What else could it be? A message board outside the morgue bears photos of those disappeared, feared dead. Without any system in place, families end up here hoping for news of their loved ones. 3 weeks ago, Maria Ramirez's husband never came home from work. She stops herself from talking about him in the past tense.
Encontrarlo de la manera que esté, sea vivo o muerto, pero encontrarlo. Esa es mi preocupación.
They're taken to a room. Finally, someone will hear their story. There, a doctor asks them when they last saw her husband. The missing are rarely found. Many are hidden in clandestine graves. If they are discovered, often they're only remains. Juan Miguel Fortin oversees the state forensics team. This month, he says, killings are on track to go down. Amidst the desperation, he is also searching for meaning.
Probablemente va a terminar con la mitad de los muertos que hubo el mes anterior, lo que también es terrible, pues, pero algo está pasando y aquí podemos nada más hacer hipótesis de trabajo, desde que se está fraguando una nueva tregua entre las pandillas, que están haciendo alguna reunión para hacer una super pandilla.
Speculation, perhaps. Answers in El Salvador are hard to find. But with so many missing and dead, those left behind have no choice but to keep looking. Adam Rainey, Al Jazeera, El Salvador.
Honduras has the highest murder rate in the world. According to the UN's most recent data, almost 8,000 people per year are murdered there, amounting to about 20 homicides per day on average. So what's going on? Why is Honduras so dangerous? Well, drug violence has been a problem for a long time in Honduras and neighboring nations. But with recent political instability stemming from a 2009 state coup, drug-based gang warfare has gotten out of control. The Mara Salvatrucha and Calle 18 are the largest and most violent of the drug gangs. These gangs obtain their wealth and power from the cocaine trade. The U.S. State Department estimates that about 80% of the cocaine destined for the U.S. passes through Honduras. However, the Honduran president has largely blamed the U.S. for the current drug violence. He says that because the U.S. consumes the largest amounts of drugs in the world, it is the U.S. that's at the root of the problem. Gangs also remain strong because of poverty and police corruption in Honduras. The World Bank estimates that about 60% of Hondurans live below the poverty line, and education quality remains low. Reports indicated that shootings and kidnappings are no longer just relegated to poorer areas as they were in the past. They are now affecting much of the upper and middle classes as well as tourist areas in the central cities. This has led the U.S. to issue a recent travel warning about Honduras, citing critically high levels of crime and violence. Additionally, the police force is reportedly corrupt and victims of gang violence themselves. It's estimated that there have been over 1,000 accusations of police corruption logged since 2012, and none of them have been investigated. More recently, a scandal within the police force ended in the national police chief being fired over human rights abuses, including accusations of running a death squad. The consequences of violence in Honduras have greatly affected the nation's children. For some who do escape the criminal life, threats of violence have driven a large number of youths outside the country. Rates of unattended children arriving at the U.S. border from Honduras have skyrocketed, partially contributing to the U.S. current immigration crisis. As a result of the endemic violence, President Obama has considered giving Honduran children refugee status, although no decision has yet been made. To learn more about how the U.S. is trying to deal with such a high number of child immigrants, check out our
This is their inherited. They inherited from the family, from the countrymen. They know. They want them to grow up as an Afghan, as we grew up in Afghanistan.
We should keep an eye on them, definitely.
But extremism is just a symptom of some Afghans' dueling identities. Most are trying to straddle the two worlds with mixed success.
Afghan children in the United States has a harder life than our life in Afghanistan because they have facing two lives, one at home under the Afghan culture, one outside the school with American culture.
When you're Afghan, but also when you live in this country, so it's like a mixture of Afghan American. Doesn't matter if I sing hip hop or R&B or pop music or rock, whatever, but I still sing it in Afghani, in Farsi language, Dari actually, and they're enjoying it.
I'm very happy to be here. I'm happy that I have a voice.
I have 5 daughters, and I like to take them someday, and they like to go someday to see, where their parents were born.
خوش دارم پس به ملک خود برم در اونجا آرام زندگی کنم من اونجا زندگی داشتم خانه داشتم وظیفه داشتم همه چیز مهیا بود ولی اینجا سرگردان میگردم هنوز زندگی من اینجا معلوم نیست که چی میشه.
I just hope that one day my kid can go back and visit.
I think we were as happy as we are here.
ومن يعمل مثقال ذرة شرا يره الله أكبر.
My name is Patricia Mazzei, and I'm the Miami-Dade government and politics reporter for the Miami Herald. The Cuban Adjustment Act is a law enacted by Congress in 1966 that allows Cuban immigrants to stay legally in the United States after only being here for 1 year and 1 day. Immigrants from other countries have to have a sponsor, either a family member or an employer, in order to apply to come to the United States legally. The United States considers Cubans a special exile group fleeing political oppression, and that's why the law was passed. The wet foot, dry foot policy was a change that was made to the Cuban Adjustment Act in 1995 that addressed when Cubans could stay in the United States. If they reached U.S. soil dry foot, then they could be eligible under the law. But if they were intercepted at sea, they would most likely be returned to the island. The Cuban Adjustment Act is in the spotlight again because President Barack Obama has changed U.S. policy toward the island. And because he wants closer relationships with Cuba, the U.S. is now negotiating with the Cuban government over many matters, and the Cuban government doesn't like the Cuban Adjustment Act. They think it gives an incentive for people to flee the island, so they would like to get rid of it. The Obama administration has not proposed that. There are some members of Congress who would like to see the act tightened so that it really does help political refugees, but not people who are taking advantage or abusing the law.
And a looming migrant crisis continues in Central America. Some 2,000 Cuban nationals have been left stranded in the region while trying to reach the United States. The Central American nations are holding conversations with the United States to find a solution to this crisis. Nicaragua requested the regional nations to discuss the issue in the upcoming Central America Integration Summit. And Cuban migrants are rushing to the United States because they fear that once relations are normalized, they will lose migratory privileges under the Cuban Adjustment Act. Now, that bill was passed by the U.S. during the Cold War, and it aims to promote Cuban artists and intellectuals to leave the island. And through this law, Cuban nationals can obtain permanent U.S. residency, the so-called green card, after a year of physically being in the country.
It's right in between both of U of H campuses, so I get to come through after class and just get my food and go.
Travis Davenport shares the daily routine many Houstonians take part in, standing in line and waiting for the doors at Les Travals to open.
The coffee's super strong. It's up here. Compared to Starbucks, it's way up here.
I do like my daily cup or cups of coffee, so I had to go into this Vietnamese cafe and try it. Several shots of espresso plus some condensed milk.
All right, here's the test.
Thumbs up, but it's just my opinion. Is the Vietnamese coffee and food the real deal? A question that can only be answered by a native from Vietnam.
Does it taste like home?
Yes, it's real.
And it has been since the 1970s when the first Vietnamese restaurant opened its doors.
Back in 1975, when most of Vietnam fled over here, a lot of the families flew here to Houston.
Anna Pham is the general manager of Mai's restaurant. The popular spot is a staple in Little Saigon that survived through the worst.
We'll get another 100 feet off 16.
The roof is about burned through. Most of the roof structure looks like it's collapsed onto the second story.
My grandma and my mom were here, and they both fell to their knees. It was one of the hardest days of my life, if not the hardest and saddest.
In 2010, a fire in the kitchen destroyed the building.
It was my shift, and it was during a morning shift when it happened. So yeah, it was heartbreaking to see your family's blood, sweat, tears kind of flash before you.
After 14 months of being out of business, the restaurant was rebuilt in the same location.
We didn't want to leave Midtown, of course.
And ready for business.
It's a melting pot in Houston. So being here, you're able to see all walks of life in Houston without even having to leave the building.
Hello, how are you doing today? There's two. Come here.
I'm proud because the restaurant A is older than me. So I got to grow into it, you know? But I love it because we get to serve Houston a taste of our culture.
Almost all of the shops in the area have been in business for decades, going strong with more to come.
Little Saigon is definitely growing.
Many Vietnamese places around here have been around for decades, which is very telling of the Vietnamese